So I'm Jane Frances Kelly, Director of the David Hume Institute. Welcome and thank you for coming. I'm going to use the time it takes you to remind yourself whether you've put your mobile to silent or not, to remind you of the next David Hume Institute event, which is a joint event with the Scottish Fiscal Commission featuring Lady Susan Rice, their Commissioner, and Robert Choate from the Office of Budget Review. That's on January the 8th. And that's tickets are going very fast for that, so do sign up. That's going to be in the Dovecot Gallery. Is it Dovecot Gallery? You'll know that, we're turning to tonight, you'll know that we recently published The Wealth of the Nation, Scotland's Productivity Challenge, and if you don't, please look in our website. That report, which we published in September, looked at what we can learn from elsewhere in turning Scotland's economy around. We explicitly put public sector productivity out of scope, which is a common problem with public sector productivity. But we did that because we barely had the resources to look at the rest of productivity, not because we're not aware of how crucially important public sector performance is, both to the health of the country's prosperity and to the experience every day of the many, many people who work in the public sector and who experience public sector public services. So we're really delighted to welcome Dr. Rolf Alter to Edinburgh because he's one of the top experts anywhere in the world on this issue. He spent very productive 25 years at the OECD. He was Chief of Staff to the current OECD Secretary General, and in 2009 was appointed Director of Public Governance, where his team supported governments around the world to improve their public sector performance. On retiring from the OECD, Rolf spent a year working for the German government, his native country, looking at the issue of public sector productivity in Germany. So he is fresh from looking at precisely this issue. In 2016, Rolf was awarded the I knew I wasn't going to trip up on this word, Dwevedi Prize by the ISIA, the International Association of Schools of Government, for outstanding contribution to public administration and policy in the world. He's currently a senior fellow of the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin. Rolf will speak in conversation with our chair, Sir John Elvage, for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open up to the floor for questions until 7:30 p.m, at which point we invite you to join us for a drink over there. Please join me in giving a really warm welcome to Dr. Rolf Alter.
So, Rolf, can I add my thanks to you for coming to help us with this important area of thinking. Part of our objective, both in the report on productivity, excluding the public sector, and now, is to lift our eyes beyond Scotland. So before we turn to the specific conclusions you've reached over the past year, perhaps you could help us by setting some international context for thinking about these issues and disabuse us of any misconceptions about the public sector in Germany that we might have.
Thank you very much, Don, and thank you very much for all of you to join me to this topic, which typically is a topic for about 9 o'clock in the morning. Because then at least I'm pretty much reassured that there is a very attentive audience. Not because of productivity, but because there is lunch. Nevertheless, you will hear me and see me talking about that question with a certain degree of urgency, even if it doesn't seem to be like that. And to start with, John, what you just suggested, I just assume that you are aware of it, what the OECD is and does. It's an organization that has by now 35 member countries, all of them industrialized countries, and have its headquarters in Paris. And it's an organization that has a very, very interesting origin. It came with the end of the war, when the very, very courageous proposal for the Marshall Plan was made. Reconstruction. That was actually the business. And there were very few people there. And very productive people, I have to say. In Paris, got together and organized, with a lot of support of the United States, obviously, but also with the allies of the war, to rebuild not just Germany, but also Europe. If you think about that, I don't want to dwell too long on it, but it is something in the history of Europe that got forgotten pretty fast, because the economic success took it all. And most countries did well, the Germans included, although they came from a low base. But everybody was supported by this idea that openness, trade, investment would make actually an excellent base for prosperity. I'd say that today in particular, because I think about where your country is, what a really critical day it is. And so I think maybe this gives you a little break from following the news when you're sitting here. No, but seriously, I do think it's a very important, I don't use that backstop, but I say it's a very important background for what I'm going to talk about. Those were people at the time, they didn't spend a lot of money, actually. The Marshall Plan was not about money in particular. It was about creating conditions for people to take opportunities, to grow, to participate, to invest, and also to take risks. When it was over, the plan was sort of executed, and in 1961, the decision was taken. This was an interesting little outfit there in Paris. We wouldn't want to let it die. We want to keep it. And that's how the OECD came into being. You could call it part of the Bretton Woods world, slightly with a different perspective, not a bank, not someone where you go to get money, just what we always were saying, you got brains, but you can use them. But not just those ones, but all the countries that were members. And many of the people who were in very important positions in their governments would come to Paris and talk about what we today in our language would say an exchange of experiences. But in reality, it was the search for good solutions, what works and also what does not work. Very critical to make sure that we have that exchange. Nothing of that is outdated. I do think it's actually still what it takes. But it's also true that at that point, the private sector and the public sector were in not only coexistence. The OECD was the first organization and actually stayed the only one where you had a tripartite approach. You would also have the business community there and also the trade unions. That was what at the time was perceived to be society. Actually, I really think it was sort of the effort to bring everybody in who at the time existed as a very important shaping force of what it was supposed to become, this Europe. And it grew. And people realized that the OECD would offer that platform of an exchange. But of course, for the first few years, actually for quite a number of years, 2 decades, I'd say, it was all about GDP. That's what counted. The more, the better. You produce and you get richer, and that makes you probably also better off in many other ways than material positions. So we got there, and then we hit 1976, the oil crisis. And I really do say that Now, don't think that I was there already in 1945. So it's not that old. No? But I can talk about it at least. I can tell you that in 76, it was the disaster. People felt that that perception of growth, reward, risk through a market would just been taken apart. Because someone decided that the price of oil would be different. The countries were not prepared, and you all probably are aware of the disaster that occurred afterwards. That was quite something. So crisis isn't new. Crisis has always been there. The issue is, are we prepared for something? And tonight, when I want to talk to you a bit about the issue of productivity, I just want to make sure we start from this point of view that there isn't the eternal truth to anything in economics, for sure not. But generally speaking, I would say there isn't any really final truth. But certainly what you can see is that it takes people, and it helps if they can somewhere talk to each other about what it is that they see as the problem, and where they think they also have to offer a solution. Just one thing that I would like to add. Then were those years between 26 and 2007, which nearly looked like the golden 20s, only that it was a little later. But certainly, if you try to think a moment back, there didn't seem to be any problem that wouldn't be solved. And in between, being from Germany, I have to say, by a stroke of history, East and West fell apart. It was just one ideology, one way to look at it. Markets had taken it all. So people spoke about the end of history. We were there. Mr. Fukuyama said, well, this is it. Huh? Now we know what to do. It was the superior idea. It has defeated the others. We're all agree. The OECD in the middle of it would say, yeah, we are the ones that are favoring globalization. And actually it took off like a very, very convincing concept. So that's the background to the discussion. John.
Okay. And did that trend, that faith in market-driven prosperity, mean that the member governments of OECD were not interested in public sector productivity as a topic? Was it something that didn't feature particularly in dialogue over those years?
I would say simply yes, they did not. I don't think that anybody in the OECD at the time spent a lot of ideas about the public sector. And frankly, I don't think that people who were in very important positions worried too much about it. Some because they thought they have a very good problem. So it's very sure. If you live in Paris, the people that are making up the civil service of France, superbly educated people, very convinced, very clear, extremely sort of fluid when you ask them to go somewhere. They have this wonderful thing that they call the Conseil d'État, where there are 412 people well-trained. You can send them anywhere where France wants them to be, and they take it. And that included also the private sector. Good company, Renault, worldwide known. Obviously, someone from the government would be in charge. No problem. But there were also those that thought we don't need all these people and it all because it's the market that will drive us. And they will make sure that this all works well. And some of our major shareholders, which includes, of course, US, Japan, Australia, later on Korea, Canada, of course, then Mexico. Was there a big issue about public sector? Not really, except for if you were saying maybe we can reduce it. That's, frankly speaking, the general tendency that there was.
And so what was it that brought public sector productivity onto the current agenda of the German government and led to the request to you to do this piece of work?
As all countries that are in the OECD today, they have the same destiny, it seems. Productivity of the private sector is coming down, and it stays there, apparently. And everybody is fixated about the idea, why is that happening? And it seems so unavoidable, and even it seems counterintuitive. Because if you think about it now, and this is not just recent, that's for a while, that you would have computers everywhere. I mean, late, but massive. The investment would take place. Public sector today, following the same trend. But when all these wonderful computers and the technology around it arrived in the private sector, we were waiting for the explosion of productivity. If I have now so many people who don't do the simple things, I just have a machine there. Okay, productivity means, okay, the guy produces X times more than before. Where is it? Where is it? It didn't show up in the statistics. And when we tried to measure that, it didn't. So there was a problem there that we felt, maybe what is this indicator saying? But then, of course, with globalization comes a very important thing that's called regulation. You want to create frameworks. Who creates these frameworks and how do they work? Are they just wait on the private sector, kill all this wonderful initiative of entrepreneurs, startups, and so on? Or would it be something that actually gives you a framework in which you operate, so it reduces risk, means that your rate of return can be a little less, and therefore you can invest because you are pretty sure that the framework stays what it is? Big question. Regulatory policy, actually something that the Americans very early invented to make it an issue of the Office of Management and Budget in the United States, which is, as you know, the office of the president. It became an issue there. The president would say, I want these regulations to go, and these ones have to be refined. It became a very important issue. And so we discovered that there was public intervention, public sector had to do something about it. But we also had, of course, these crises in between where the public sector had to deliver to unemployed people, to people who were ill. We already saw aging population means more health services had to be provided. So you have a growing demand for the services of the state. And who would now provide these services in the most efficient way? So the question, when I say most efficient, well, people would say, that looks like productivity. So you're talking about productivity in the public sector. So the discussion became more relevant because there were more concerns. It was not just growth. It was also making sure that people get through phases of unemployment. And it's also true that they are taken care of and that they are also educated well, because that's an issue where we need to be investing for the future. So, if I may say, the perspective widened. And it became, yes, here is the private sector. Here we can measure because there is a price, and there is a market. So I know if I have 100 people working on it, they sell their products for 1,000. I know what the productivity of these people is. Straightforward, nothing too complicated. But what happens when it comes to the public sector? And there the questioning came back. What do we do with this animal? A lot of people, yes, we need them, but do they do the right things? And just to say, Mrs. Thatcher said, there are too many of them, we'll just privatize. We'll just make sure, I mean, I'm characterizing a bit. But it was a bit like that. And people said, okay, if that's, we can get rid of this question of are they productive or not, we'll just shift it off to the private sector and that would help. No? Big model. This lady really changed the world in many ways, but also in those terms, for sure. Privatization, big thing. And then, of course, comes the time when we say, no, it's not enough. It doesn't have to be privatized. We can also outsource. We can put work that's normally done or was done out there in the private sector. And then came a phase where we said, no, all the people in the private sector have to work exactly like the business sector. So we called this new public management. So we had these different phases and people thought about it. So the answer is, how did it come? A bit through crisis, a bit because we had these expectations that the rule had to be set, a bit by, of course, the fact that if I am collecting taxes and I have to spend them, I'm also accountable for spending it well. But not least, because we discovered that some of the things are not being solved by just the market. It takes the public sector.
Okay, so the obvious question is, what conclusions did you reach about how we can improve our thinking about public sector productivity?
I would like to answer sort of in two stages. The one thing you see is when you talk and think what we measured by productivity, this thing about how much do I put in and what comes out of it? And it was how much we produce. How much we produce. Would productivity tell us how much that it takes from existing resources like our environment? No. Would it tell us what we do when it comes to migration? No. To climate change, does it change if I know that productivity is high or low? What does it tell me about climate change? Nothing. Inequality. We realized that after the crisis of 2007, we had this enormous increase in inequality. Bad for growth, bad for the people, bad for the economy, bad for political cohesion. Is there anything that comes out of productivity when I know it's back? No. Neither on poverty, neither on precarity. So when I say we realize that productivity is perhaps an indicator for material growth, but for the rest of it, it doesn't seem to matter so much. So here we are by saying this way that we are so concerned with what it is, I think is a very flawed indicator. The second part is to say, is that an indicator that applies to measure the public sector well? Now, this is a question, of course, where you have to ask yourself, okay, what is the public sector for me? The services, security, the rule of law, certain cohesion, defense at the borders. It's all these wonderful things that nobody realizes that they are to be produced somehow, but they are there. And they make our life, I would say, pretty much better than it is in many places in this world where nothing of that is there. The rule of law doesn't come by itself. You have to invest in it. A clean environment doesn't come by itself. You have to do something about it. So in a sense, public sector delivers a lot of things in a different way. And imagine, don't you want to make sure that the rule of law applies to everybody? Or is it just for someone who knows how to to go to a lawyer and then go through your court system and so on? Or should it be access for everybody? Health, should it be for a few or for everybody? Should everybody include it there? How do you deliver to old people, to elderly people? How do you do that? Through your internet? Or do you think you need something else there as well? So the question is not just the quantity of services, but it's also the quality of these services. And that means, unfortunately, that's not included in our ideas about productivity as a measure. So I have my doubts that we can just simply say, okay, we put the same measurement there and say whether it's a good or a bad public service. We need to be a little more sophisticated. And I think the key conclusion for all this work, there are three of them. The first is really to say, let's make sure that we think in different terms for the public sector, not to excuse them, not to take them apart, but to be well informed when we take decisions. And that means we have to look for the performance of the public sector. The second is that we have to be very clear in what actually we want to achieve through public policies. It doesn't help if someone says, well, we need to support families. What does that mean? And if you want people to do a good job, you have to be very clear in what it is that you want to change there. So you need political decisions that are actually focusing on very clear objectives. Do we have that these days? I doubt it. And thirdly, we need to be sure that once we run it, we spend money on it, we regulate, we offer these services, we need to have some sort of an evaluation system behind that. It says, yes, we got there. No, we didn't get there. But in all of that, it's not an issue of the government. It's an issue of communities. It's people. When you want to do something really that should be positive for people, you will have to consult with them. You have to bring them in, and you have to be open to what actually those people either themselves want or what kind of community-based work, for example, could be organized. So it's a complex operation, this public sector. We can't do without it, but we should do everything to make it extremely well performing. It's worthwhile, the investment. It makes a difference for everybody who lives in the country. So the conclusion is also, how do we make sure that everybody pays attention to it, works on it, and helps to make that public sector what it actually can deliver at a reasonable price, but also in a way that makes a difference for people. We're not talking, we have to provide systems. We have to provide systems, yes, but the ultimate outcome is whether or not people are better off. We'll call it well-being, but that's just a summary sort of all the good things that can happen. But it is an important discussion, and unfortunately, I have to say, very often this discussion doesn't take place. Scotland is a place where it takes place, not least to your extremely important contribution in the Scottish, can I say after the Scottish crisis or the difficulties? No, can I say that? No, you're right. But it started is a very interesting moment, because I have listened to Sir John. I realize very much that it's also a specific circumstance that was there that allowed you. But one thing is to say it allows you, the other thing is to do it and really get engaged. And today, I would say when I look at what we have done sort of the last few years, Scotland is in everybody's mind these days. When you talk about how do you make this idea of well-being not an idea, but a practical approach to policy. I really do think there are only a very, very few countries where I would say that. But we have also worked together in making it reality. And that change, that mentality, that mindset, to change the mindset towards the value of a very performing public sector. It's a long-term effort, but it's certainly worth it.
And that framework of measurement of the components of well-being that has been developed in Scotland, should that make it easier for us than for others to grapple with the challenges of understanding public sector productivity?
It wouldn't only make it easier, but I'd like to put this out there. Scotland is part of the world, first of all of the UK, and then of the Commonwealth, and then of the rest of the world. But the rest of the world, 2 years ago, decided in the United Nations that they would go for Sustainable Development Goals. Sustainable Development Goals. People are sometimes very critical about the United Nations. I think none of the other organizations has ever achieved that degree of common judgment and agreement on a set of objectives that are now applied worldwide. And what does it say? It says, when you look at what public policy has to deliver, there are 16 objectives. I mean, we can talk about it, whether they're all the same value and so on and so on. But in the end, it's the first time that that has been formulated and now accepted that we should go there. The contribution of Scotland is to say, yeah, there is a way to do it. Because although everybody has agreed that this makes sense to go for these objectives, the how-to is for most countries still something a little obscure. And I have to say, it was a surprising result of my work in Berlin these last months. The Germans are convinced that they are in the world of sustainability for 15 years already. But when you asked, okay, if it's so clear, whom can I talk to make sure that I find the responsible guy? Well, that's... Let me think about it, but I will give you an answer. No, I mean, this is really, there is no practical work going on. And this is, I'm saying that with some reference to my country, it's a very proud civil service. People think that they have a lot of things to offer. And actually most in the I would say among the population is agreeing with that. I saw some recent research on that. Civil service has a very great level of trust. When you go to the parliament and the government, it's less so. But the civil service has worked pretty well, and I think it has something to do with the fact that Germany, as you know, is a country of cities, actually. So people live, it's a certain structure. And in each city you have a government, and each government in the city has to provide the services. So for people, they think about it, oh, yeah, it pretty works. And if it doesn't work, it's definitely first Berlin. They must be in charge. They cannot work, but it's true if you look at infrastructure. Or if it doesn't help that it is not Berlin, for sure it's Brussels. So we always have an explanation.
Well, we're very familiar here with the device of passing the blame upwards. You've painted an enormously broad picture, Rolf, and that seems a good moment to let everyone else in on the conversation you've offered us. Lots of intriguing threads to pull at here. So who would like to either comment or direct a question at Rolf? Please.
Yes, David Black is my name. I worry a great deal about this sort of overlap between the state and the private sector. I don't know how it works in Germany, Italy, or Spain, or whatever. But in Britain, we've had this tendency, and we can't simply blame Margaret Thatcher, to bring in a private sector expertise, as we see it, into the public sector. For example, she brought in the head of Marks and Spencer's as an advisor. Rather unsuccessfully, David Cameron brought in Sir Philip Green. You know, Tony Blair brought in Alan Sugar. And then they get this idea that the civil service should be made more businesslike. And they have people like Sir Michael Lyons saying non-departmental public bodies should sweat their assets. Now, I think there's a temperamental difference between the civil servant and the entrepreneurial capitalist. And that's a very difficult gap to bridge, in a way. So we end up with initiatives in Britain in 2008. Tony Blair and Gordon Brown came up with this thing called the Widening Markets Initiative. And the idea was that especially non-departmental public bodies could look at what their assets were, and then they could, which they should have been doing anyway, without any, and then they should capitalize on them in a sense. So the waterways people had sort of buildings which were redundant, and they made them into nice coffee shops and things like that. And that was okay, that was harmless. But then a lot of these bodies set up licensing systems and so on and discovered they were, on the one hand, they could be a regulator, on the other hand, they could be a competitor with others in that sector, and that became a bit of a mess. I don't know, and I think it also was a lot to expect of classically trained civil servants to suddenly become kind of barrow boys or whatever. I just think it was not... Now, does that happen in other countries? I mean, or was this a particularly British disease?
Yeah, it's only here. No. Can tell you that was a wonderful stories that would come over to these meetings in Paris. I think you were touching on, it's one of my favorite topics when you talk about the detail of these so-called new public management. That meant that it's all an issue of management. But I will tell you, you spoke about the waterways, but you see, this is true for quite a number of those industries, these infrastructure industries, where certainly out of risk management principles, private sector would look at these business very differently than public sector. And it is true, you see, if you look at energy policy or energy producers, today, France is a very important example. As you know, France has a lot of nuclear energy, especially when it comes to electricity. They are exporters of energy to the rest of Europe. The regulator was supposed to just make sure that the market worked. And the entrepreneur, the investor, supposedly that the results and that not only the private sector, but also households were always procured a lot with energy. But what do you do when you have only 3 suppliers of energy, and you are the regulator? You are supposed to say, we need more investment. We need more security in energy provision, and we need to make sure that also the energy is available in the far east corner of each country. How do you do that? If you are not cooperating very well with the private investors, or the private investors very well cooperating with you as a regulator. This becomes a tricky piece of public policy. You want to have independence of the regulator, but you also would like to have a market-based provision of energy. You want to have equal access for everybody in the country to energy, but that's not necessarily a very good way to make money. So we choose certain forms of organizing the public sector which are not necessarily producing the best results. But do we know that for sure? Very rarely, because these types of policies were never really evaluated. So what we see is a form of public and private cooperation that has not necessarily achieved a better performance. And what you see now, this is the past. But if you look at it today, if you think about providers of information, if I may call it that way, if you look at big tech companies, somehow they are the bottleneck for information. And since there are only a very, very few number of them, information goes through them. Have we been able to regulate that market? No. There is no regulation because everybody thought that internet is something to be free. Free. But when you have a market, you know, what is exchanged on this market? Data. But data about clients. So we don't have a right on your data established. We have not created an ownership of your own data, which means there is no price for it. Some of the people there, they say in this industry, well, data are the new oil or the steel of the new economy. I always say that's a very, very interesting comparison. But what is the price for oil? We can actually see it every day. What is the price for steel? You can look at it in every part of the world. You will find the price for steel. And what is the price for data? We don't know. So that's a very interesting market. And once again, the point of how far is it a private affair and how much is it a public affair? If you listen to Mr. Cook from Apple, he himself says now, oh, we would like to have a little more regulation here. So it's a long answer or a long comment to what you're saying, but my point here is where there are interactions, I think we need to be really extremely precise in what we want, what is a good model, but then there should be also someone who says, after a while, we'll just make a nice evaluation and we'll find out. And for that, you see, the Australians, they have something which is called the Productivity Commission. Unique in the world, really. An independent body that actually is charged to make this type of evaluations. And you can see that they never feared the truth. They actually published it, and it is an institution that make you really envious of that type of quality of analysis and evaluation. And politicians respect it. Please.
Sorry, I got the microphone first. My name is June Andrews. I want to ask you about something that I've observed here in Scotland and in the UK, to find out from you whether this is something that you see in other countries where you've worked and studied. And you spoke about the difficulty in measuring productivity when what's being produced is welfare. One of the very important things is the people who work in that area. One of the things that I've noticed from the difference between people who work in the private sector and the public sector is that, and I've worked in both, is that when people are working in the public sector in Scotland, they feel that they're occupying the high moral ground, and they, in some sense, are disrespectful of private sector colleagues. If I gave a really sharp example, 80% of the care of older people who require institutional care in Scotland is given by private sector providers. We don't have public hospital wards, geriatric wards anymore, and the NHS beds and the local authority beds, because of their unaffordability, don't exist anymore. But it's very seldom that you hear anybody saying anything good about the private sector who provide care for older people. You know, they make profit from old people. And nurses even saying, I didn't come into this job to work in a private company. I'm here to serve the public. Do you get that kind of dichotomy in other countries between the private and the public sector? Not just in terms of productivity, but in terms of how people regard the moral issues of working in either sector?
And just to provide a fair crack of the whip, we'll take the other point.
Okay, thank you. It's somewhat related to the last question. My own background is in education, but the last 15 years I've been a non-executive director in the health service, both in England and in Scotland. And in the Scottish Health Service, for instance, we claim to make efficiency gains year on year, between 1% and 2%, despite the fact that we continue to overspend. What's quite interesting in my own health board is that we've been looking towards the US, for instance, where a number of the privately run hospital systems can demonstrate that they are more efficient than we are in the UK, being able to do a number of procedures for less cost and so on. And yet, at a political level, the American system could be described as a complete disaster because they spend an enormous amount of money and get very, very lower results. And it seems to me that there's a whole lot of problems around, if you like, a lack of honesty as to what is efficiency in the public sector. And if I could just do one final anecdote, which is to say that when I was working in England and we decided to have the kind of split between the commissioners and the providers so that each individual locality made their own decisions, everybody then shouted about a postcode lottery. And I felt like saying, well, isn't that what local choice is? So it seems to me that we're not really addressing a number of these issues honestly. And without that honesty, it's difficult to see how we can make the kind of efficiencies that you've referred to.
Thank you very much for those questions. In fact, I think they actually belong nicely together. You see, respect comes from, very often at least, knowing about the other. And I do think that there is ample space for improving understanding. There are not many people who move between these two sectors. I would say German civil servants that leave the civil service to work in the private sector are rare, and they never come back once they've left, for whatever reasons. But it definitely, exchange of experience, basically not existent. And that means that you can, of course, carry your prejudices easier because you don't really know exactly what the other one is doing. On the other hand, you see, something has changed in countries, in most countries. Business associations and trade unions have lost a lot of their previous ground. People are on their own, much more than it is before. That makes also, from a very German point of view, collaboration, exchange with the other side, much less of an issue anymore. That has its good sides, there's no doubt about it, but it has also the disadvantage that there isn't any useful joint view of what needs to be done to become more efficient or to be better organized for the public good or to be really a private sector provider. It's a very strange thing that when you normally speak about better outcomes, you talk about collaboration. You would want to do something that then allows you to achieve a better result. But that is gone. And I think it has turned the labor market into something very different than it was before. Of course, when there is full employment, it doesn't really matter that much. But when it isn't, it makes a lot of a difference in the weight and then the respect between business and the private sector and the public sector. But there is another issue. I think I observed that for many years. Ministers, politicians that would come in, they would very much and very often, I have to say really, use the public sector to have room for maneuver. It sounds like very good that you're saying, this private sector is much more effective in providing it, so we need to cut. And you can see it nearly every government that I know of comes in and says the first thing is we'll cut that. We'll cut the number of people there, we'll make them abundant because they are not productive enough. It may well be, but I have never seen any of these issues being actually based on evidence. I said it at another occasion today. You know, I would honor Mr. David Hume, who has said that a wise man proportions his beliefs to the evidence. That doesn't seem to be always the case, but that would be very, very helpful. At the same time, to think about the private sector as being particularly bad because profit-oriented is a big, big misconception of what it means to work in market economies. I don't think that we have any better models to offer at the same time. So I don't think that we should see this as controversy. We should make sure that we see it as complementary. Public and private really has to be working very well together. Then it makes a big difference. And if you come to a very specific example like the health service, for sure, you know, when you see aging, the Germans are aging not necessarily faster, but more of them are already at advanced ages. The question of elderly care is a highly political issue. And it's a question of financing. Of course, who will be taking care of the people? If you look at what the models are, these days there is an enormous amount of investment in elderly care. Really, money is being invested. The same is true for housing. People say, well, it's not enough supply of housing, so what do we need to do? My point here is that I still would think to use public rules, regulation, but not necessarily to provide all the services. There may be ample room for that. And there are certain places where it would need to be that way, even because of reasons of technology and so on and so on. But there is also something where I'd say we need to make sure that public service is not just a service provided, but it is also a service provided to a community. Does it have to be the government? No. Could it be communities that get self-organized, people who try to do something jointly? We haven't exploited that at all. I know that there is in Scotland, there is what is called the Share Lab, no? A sort of people that think about it, how we make technology available for different services, for example, to elderly people. I find that's a fantastic idea. So we should get out of this either or. We should rather say maybe someone has a very good idea to get organized themselves. But at the end, we need to be sure that we achieve what was intended. And you see, there are in different countries different views of what, for example, health service should provide. The United States, as you will very well know, has gone through this enormous reform program of Obamacare. If you think that one of the, if not the richest country, has no coverage of about 45% of the people for health services, you could say, that's our choice. And I don't think that one can reject these type of choices. But then make a difference, a comparison between efficiencies for a system that is there for the whole of the population as compared to a selected number of people who pay for that. That's not really evidence. If you compare apples with pears, it won't work. And that's what I think is sometimes missing. Maybe not the kind of honesty that you meant, sir, but I do think that honesty means also that we really are sure that the evidence we want to produce as analysts, experts, as people who would like to contribute to the debate, we need to be sure that we explain very well what we are measuring and what we're not measuring.
My name is Richard Curley. Following your CV, I assume you were in and out of Germany and back to Paris during the period after 1989. Your recent study, has it shown if there are enduring differences in approaches to public sector provision and productivity between the former Western Länder and the Eastern Länder? We know from data that economically, socially, and politically, there are significant differences between one group and the other group. Does that show up in public sector performance?
And we have another contributor down here.
Thank you. Graham McCormick. My interest is in the relationship between political leadership and the actual professional public service servants. We in Scotland, or some would consider in Scotland, that in local government we have a demographic deficit because we only have 32 executive councils. However, there is also a fear that if we increase the number of councils, that would increase the cost to the public purse. But councillors of all political persuasions complain that their political aspirations for delivery of policies is often hampered or curtailed because the councils basically are controlled by the professional officers. And I wonder whether, in your experience, there is a case for the political leadership of a council to be a separate entity from the actual council itself, or the public servants who manage that council. They could still be in the public sector, but not be basically the same entity.
Okay, thank you very much. On Germany, you see, in November 89, a very unusual thing has happened. 17 million people were fundamentally provided within 24 hours with a legal system. You could call it really the rule of law, with an administration, and with quite a bit of money. Conditions that are rare when you talk about development, very rare. It didn't really work as expected. And one of the differences that we are realizing even 25 years later, and there are still differences, and I'm not talking about the difference in the minds of people to speak about East and West, but also difference in performance, both private and public sector. They do persist, they show up in the private sector by definitely lower wages. You could say, well, this is over there and here, but think about it, we're talking about the same country now. And despite all the investment that made and all the institutional framework that was made available immediately, to still have these differences tells you something about the difficulty to adjust. And I'm taking that very often as an example for people who want other countries to adjust very fast to difficult situations. I take my own country's very harsh stance at Greece. Not that I think there need to be a lot of adjustment, but if you see the conditions for in this place, then you would say, well, we had probably a better start there and still didn't get there. But there's also a difference in the private sector. I said wages. In the public sector, the differences are very often in the way that these services are provided because the population has changed. You see, many of those young people have left. And obviously, the older people who stayed behind, they are depending to a very different degree on public assistance. So therefore, while we also think that equality should reign, it would need a lot more of investment over there to make sure that the conditions are actually more equal than that. But there is another debate about that, and I'll just finish there, but to say Chancellor Kohl, and this decisive 3 months, he decided, against the advice of the Central Bank of Germany, that the rights, pension rights acquired in the eastern part of Germany would be accepted 1-to-1. That, of course, was a very political decision. But it means that while everybody says, they are treated the same way in a formal sense, the reality looks pretty different. So the point here is simply to say, even when you strive for equality and similar outcomes, when you take into account the differences in structure, in population, and in remaining economic activity, you have to admit, yes, there are differences still in the two countries. And they seem to persist despite very good conditions for a different outcome. Adjustment is more complicated than one would think. And to your question about the relationship between the political leadership, in a way, and those that are civil service, yeah, I think that's another degree, it's another complexity actually there. And we have seen this in many places where there is, again, a lack of really separation of the different roles. But it's also a lack of understanding of the different roles. I will just talk about federal ministries. You see, most of those ministries have, for example, in France, a secretary general. It's the top person of the civil service. But you have that, of course, here as well. Sometimes, I have seen it, the incoming political leadership would not know exactly what this gentleman or that lady is good for. The normal way would be to say, why don't I ask them what they can do for me? But before that, you rather have cabinets, political people around you. In France, it has been a rule nearly that you would have cabinets of 50 or so people. These are politically determined people that come in because they understand what the minister would know, they know what the direction should be, and so on and so on. So they have certainly a lot of substantive knowledge about where to go. On the what and how to get there, it would be useful to have these other people being consulted is a little complicated when there is no understanding. But of course, Secretary Generals, in this case, to function well, would need to withhold their political conviction as well. It can only work if you have that type of discipline of accepting that there are different roles. Here's a political leader with a mandate, and here is someone who knows how to run an organization. Combined, excellent. Tension and war between these levels, very difficult. Mr. Macron said at the time, it was already President Hollande, but President Macron has established that there shouldn't be more than 20 advisors for each minister. It was perceived as being really like, an impossible demand, only 20. I don't know whether it's enough or it's too small. That's not the point. But you can see there is a tension there, but it requires that each of the partners is aware of what the role of the other is and also what kind of responsibility each of them have. If you are a minister, you have to go back. And if you want to be elected, you have to face your citizens. The Secretary General doesn't. So there is a bit of a difference there. Yeah?
Okay, we've probably got time for one more round, and I think I can see I can see 3 hands. So I can see 4 hands. Yes, do.
My name is Paul Hare from Heriot-Watt University. There are a couple of things I want to say. First, quite a long time ago, an American Nobel Prize winning economist, Bob Solow, made the remark that you could see computers everywhere in the American economy except in the GDP statistics. And more recently, Robert Gordon, another American economist, wrote a very interesting book about American growth and productivity change. And he discussed this IT problem and said, well, maybe it'll be reflected in the productivity and growth statistics, 40, 50 years down the line. Maybe it just takes a bit longer and we're in too much of a hurry to see it. Now, coming to the present, when we think about measuring productivity in the public sector, we have a bit of an inherent difficulty, because going back to what I said about GDP a minute ago, when we measure the GDP contribution of a department of government or a school or something like that, what we normally do is just measure the wage bill. That's how the national accountants do it. So inherently, as wages go up, the output is recorded as going up. But we all know that that's not really measuring anything to do with productivity in a more objective sense. But in the public sector, we don't have any sort of output that is chosen to maximize productivity. So we tend to go for various performance indicators, and that can lead you into quite tricky areas. Like, for example, in a primary school, you could say, well, let's aim for bigger class sizes, a class size of 50 or 60. That doubles the productivity of your teachers. But not many people would consider that that gave rise to better education. Similarly, in a hospital, you could set an indicator for surgeons telling them they had to do 29 operations in a particular day. And again, you might not think that was great for productivity, because if they try and do all this in a terrible hurry, there might be a slightly higher death rate on the surgical wards. So actually measuring productivity in a way that is really measuring something sensible, I think is a lot more difficult in the public sector than we normally assume it is in the private sector. If I'm measuring the productivity in a biscuit factory, I know that the output is so many biscuits per shift, let's say, and we have a market price for biscuits. So the whole setup is a lot easier and more natural. But how you do something corresponding to that in the public sector is a continuing mystery, I would say.
Thank you. Jennifer Wallace from the Carnegie UK Trust, and thank you for such an interesting conversation. I think it really helps us here to put our local conversations into an international and a historic context. So thank you for that. My question is really around what I know you will be familiar with as the Scottish model of government, of which the National Performance Framework is one part of it. And you will know that in Scotland we have quite a sophisticated policy framework and sophisticated rhetoric around it. But we do seem to struggle to put that into practice, particularly when it comes to budgeting for outcomes. And I wondered if you knew anything from elsewhere and from your experience on why it might be difficult to shift the money around, and what we might be able to do, bearing in mind that the next Scottish budget is not too far off now. Thank you.
Okay, with an eye on the clock, we will just fit everybody's questions or points in. So right at the back.
Thank you. My name is Bill Howett. I have experience in both central government and local government. And if the gentleman, Mr. McCormick, would like to talk to me at the end, I'm going to have an interesting exchange with him. Thank you for an interesting talk. Can I take you right back to your very opening remarks when you talked about the Marshall Plan? I thought you had a very, very good explanation there when you made the point that the Marshall Plan, contrary to mythology, was not about huge amounts of money. It was about creating the conditions in which people could invest and take risk and grow. And I would like to remind everyone about that, because what I'm about to develop is the theme that surely that's the role of any government, never mind the Marshall Plan. And you then went on, interestingly, immediately after that to outline the three main, well, what are usually put as the three main areas for government about security, law, and providing the right social conditions and so on. So very much that's what public sector ought to be about. And I put it to you that that's a very hard thing. That if you take that as your starting point, how do you then look at productivity? Now, to juxtapose that, can I take you now to the private sector? And a phrase that's not particularly been used tonight, but one that's begun to irritate me over the years, is the concept of market failure. I put it to you, sir, that markets don't fail. By definition, if you think about it, a market is a place where goods and services come together, people, buyers and sellers, and some kind of exchange of information takes place, goods exchange hands, and a price is determined. That's what a market does. It can't fail. It can give you a result you don't like. And that's where public policy comes in. And what I would like you to do is juxtapose those two on the premise that what we need, somebody mentioned honesty earlier, if we could face up to that and say, where markets are not actually providing us with the result that we want, here are the outputs, the outcomes, the conditions that we want to achieve, and here, O public sector, public servants, deliver them. I invite your comments, sir.
Thank you very much. The last question is, of course, for my next master thesis, and I will work on it. But no, I come back to you, sir. Yeah. You're saying it's complicated with the private sector. We have to be patient. Maybe we will see the impact of the wonderful computers in 40 years. So patience, okay. I would say for the public sector, we need certainly a degree of patience, but what we more need is investment in research. See, I do really think the complexity of what you're saying is, I don't at least think there's only one conclusion. We need to understand better. And I would say, before we formulate new requirements for performance objectives, we should be sure that we know what we're actually asking for and what we measure. But productivity will not do in the public sector for sure, but performance will do. And performance will mean that we need to be very clear in where we want to go and what it is that we are looking for, output or outcome. It's a big difference between the two. I don't have to tell you that, but I'm just saying we are very often measuring in output. But is that what public policy is about, or is it the outcome that we create certain conditions? And I will come back to what you were just saying, sir. So there is an issue about how do we make sure that we be clear on what we want to achieve. One thing for sure, you see, with productivity, with that indicator, and it's nothing but an indicator, it's not an objective, it was an indicator for getting us somewhere. We had not factored in the damage to the environment with which we now have to work with. Now, if someone is trying to make the environment clean it up, as we say, that's an increase in our prosperity because that shows up in the GDP. I don't think that that's a very good measure. And there are a few others of those where the question really is, can we have an agreement of what this society would like to see? What is it exactly? We're talking about public interest. And even if I know that public interest is a wide area, we have created in democracies institutions that are supposedly to deliver on it. So let's make them work according to what we expect them. It's a very high ambition, I know. But I don't think that ambition is in any event not a good thing when it comes to public interest. That's why I think we need to be reminding everybody that public interest, to generate it, to live by it, means a very high degree of very important values to be respected. Values to be respected. And unfortunately, I can see quite a few cases where they are not respected. And then we get into the confusion about what public interest actually is. You spoke about, Jennifer, about the issue of why is it so complicated to make money and performance linked up. The bad news is that I cannot give you any country that has really succeeded in developing it to the degree of perfection. It's just not there. You can check the world where they want to make sure that we talk about performance-based budget. There isn't an ideal little blueprint that we just have to take and put it into other countries and then it will work. But I tell you that the good news is that we're talking about performance and budgets. That's not something which was there before. And in many countries, we're still talking about budget as being an expenditure. Thank you. An expenditure. But what we do with this expenditure is a little less clear to most people who have to work by that. But we have developed a very sense for that we need to look at what is it that public expenditure is supposedly to generate. It is still not perfect. The institutional setups are not quite the same. But one big issue is indicators. When do you know when the performance is achieved? And there were quite a number of countries that have, how would I say, drowned in the number of indicators. They have so many that nobody can manage this anymore. Now we have in the last few years sort of a retrenchment to say, well, if we have 4 or 5 of them, high-level ones, and then we sort of decline, we fill them with individual measures, that's progress. And I do think that the idea that performance has something to do with both money, but also with what the people who spend it and have the authority to spend it are really aware of that type of scrutiny that is applied. And I do think that this transparency has to be applied in public business exactly as a market would do. Apply it and say, have you done that or not? The Americans, and sometimes are in their pragmatic way, have done some of that. And I think it's worthwhile sometimes to look at that. But then when you look at it, it's the country that has the highest overall debt burden. So they do these, but then they lost track of that there was something of macroeconomics involved. But I don't criticize the US, never, it's the country of origin. But let me say, you're saying that there is no market failure. Yeah, in a pure sense, as you describe it, I have to say, yeah, if we can live with any result that comes out of it, and we're saying, well, that's the result of the market, and therefore it doesn't fail, it just produces things that we don't like, could be. It's a definitional issue. But if we're saying we have, as a society, objectives in mind, I think we should use the mechanism of markets where they are able to provide it. And for private goods, very often it works. Except for that we also have to think about the damages that are not incorporated in markets. You see, when you have a market price that doesn't reflect that in the meantime, while producing cars, you destroy environment, then we would need to make sure that either these costs are incorporated, or we have to say we give up on our environment. So the issue is not, do they function well enough? Surely. But what about the results? And I do think that currently we have a lot of issues where I wouldn't know how governments could just let it happen by themselves. For the environment, we haven't found anything yet that would let the private sector solve it. But it doesn't mean that the government has to do it themselves. We just need to make sure that we write exactly what conditions we would like to be seen, met by the private investors. If we can describe that, after that, I do agree with you, we'll just let them do this. But if we don't, or we write rules, but we don't make them actually stick, that's bad. And remember, the first global crisis, 2007 and 2008, was not made in some emerging economy. No. It emerged from the most advanced country in the world. And it hit the world with a vengeance. Not today we have solved the issues there. Not even today. Let alone that in the meantime we have had 10 years for people that have not had their lives. But we're even now there. And what was it? It was a system that would allow banking business being carried out outside banking supervision. And for this part of the business, in the Californian case, they had 30 people to do this. 30 people who worked for the government to control, observe, restrict the activities of these sort of people. Unfortunately, 30 were not quite enough. And what do we do there? I think that was a market failure which will stay in the books of history for a long while. So there had to be made a choice between whether we accept whatever comes out of it is a market, or whether we are saying that doesn't work. And you can see the results. I have certainly lived through that period. A financial crisis becomes an economic crisis, becomes a social crisis, becomes a political crisis. But not limited to some place, somewhere, where we could say, well, these people are really not able. No, in the middle of it. in the middle of our OECD advanced world, where we were so convinced that failures would be elsewhere. This one wasn't, but this one really leveled the playing field for a lot of people in this world. Some got away with it, others have recovered, but there are still a number of people who cannot recuperate their 10 years in which they have lived through a lot of misery. So I have a certain, as you certainly feel, reservation for leaving it only to markets.
Thank you, Rolf. We've reached the point to make a transition to a more informal style of discussion around some glasses of wine. You've told us very clearly that your work demonstrates that public sector productivity is a neglected dimension of thinking both about the public sector and about productivity. You've pointed out the complexities involved in attempting to grapple with the inherent challenges of thinking about public sector productivity. And you've made the point forcefully that if all we do is tackle a series of technical problems around measuring public sector productivity, we will have made no contribution whatsoever to our thinking about the major challenges that face both this society and societies around the world. And in doing that, you've shared enormously generously with your great breadth of experience and given us an extraordinary tour around points of reference. And I think perhaps the greatest tribute to what you've offered us this evening is that I can't recall a David Hume Institute occasion on which people have felt that this was the moment to bring out their deepest philosophical questions and throw them at you. And I think the fact that you have stimulated us to think about and talk about the genuinely fundamental issues that underlie the role of the public sector in society is of enormous value to us in taking debates about the future of Scotland forward. So thank you very much.